Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture
Oh, interesting.
by Dan Kovalik. Now, you might be thinking another book bashing cancel culture.
Right.
But hold on. This isn't your typical diatribe from the right. Kovalik is a progressive lawyer, a labor lawyer, and a human rights activist, and he's coming at this from a perspective you rarely hear.
Yeah, you don't often hear that take, do.
Not really, no. So he's arguing that cancel culture, far from being a tool for social justice, is actually undermining the very causes it claims to champion. He's concerned about its impact on the left, on free speech, and on the possibility of meaningful dialogue and debate.
Yeah, and I think that's a perspective that a lot of people who are maybe on the fence about cancel culture or even supportive of it, in some ways it's a perspective they should really consider because he's coming from a place of wanting to see those social justice causes succeed.
Exactly.
And he's arguing that this tactic is ultimately going to harm those causes.
Okay, so let's dive into the book and see how he builds this argument.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, Kovalik tackles the challenge of defining what exactly we mean by cancel culture and woke. What are his working definitions for these slippery terms?
Well, he acknowledges that there's no universally agreed upon definition.
Right.
But he offers clear parameters for how he's using these terms. For Kovalik, cancel culture is essentially a form of social and political ostracism.
Okay.
A way of withdrawing support from someone, often publicly and quite aggressively, because of something they said or did that's deemed unacceptable.
And this often plays out on social media, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all seen those pylons where someone gets called out for a problematic tweet or comment, and suddenly they're facing a barrage of criticism and demands for accountability.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the main arena where this stuff happens now, isn't it? It's, social media, it's so quick and it's so easy to just, like and retweet and share and dunk on somebody for saying something you disagree with.
Yeah. And Kovalik is very concerned about the role of social media in amplifying this dynamic.
Yeah.
He argues that these platforms, with their algorithms designed to maximize engagement, often create echo chambers and reward outrage, making it difficult to have nuanced and reasoned discussions.
Absolutely. I think we all have seen how algorithms can really shape what we see and how we think about things. And, the more you click on something, the more of that you're going to get. And it can really create these echo chambers where you're only hearing from people who agree with you and you're not getting exposed to different perspectives.
And it's not just about expressing disagreement. It often goes further, right? People lose their jobs. Their reputations are tarnished. They face real-world consequences for expressing views that might be controversial or unpopular.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where it goes beyond just, online disagreement. This is where people's livelihoods and their lives can be really negatively impacted.
And Kovalik argues that this creates a chilling effect on free speech, where people are afraid to express their honest opinions for fear of being canceled. He provides numerous examples of individuals from academics to activists who have faced professional and personal repercussions for expressing views that fall outside the bounds of acceptable discourse.
Yeah, and I think this is one of his most important points, because when you have this climate of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds, even if they have, legitimate concerns or different perspectives, then you really stifle debate and you prevent the kind of open exchange of ideas that's essential for a healthy society.
So that's cancel culture.
Yeah.
What about woke? How does Kovalik define this equally loaded term?
Well, for Kovalik, woke is a form of heightened awareness of social justice issues, particularly those related to race, gender, and identity.
Okay.
And while he acknowledges the importance of raising awareness about injustice, he argues that woke ideology often takes this awareness to an extreme, leading to a hypersensitivity to perceived offenses and a tendency to view the world through a very narrow lens.
Okay, so it's like everything becomes a potential violation, a microaggression, a sign of systemic oppression.
Yeah.
And while it's crucial to be aware of these issues, Kovalik seems to be suggesting that this hypervigilance can be counterproductive, even harmful.
Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at. He's saying that, when you see everything through this lens of, oppression and injustice, it can make it very difficult to have constructive conversations, to build bridges, to find common ground.
It's like this constant state of outrage and indignation.
Yeah.
And I think he's arguing that that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately not effective in achieving the goals of social justice.
It can be alienating to people, too.
Exactly.
Who might be sympathetic to the cause, but then they're just turned off by that kind of approach.
So we've got these definitions in place, but how does Kovalik connect them to the decline of the left? He argues that cancel culture is actually hurting progressive movements,
Mm.
which seems counterintuitive. How does he make that case?
Well, his argument here is that cancel culture alienates potential allies and creates divisions within the left itself.
Hmm.
He argues that the focus on ideological purity and the tendency to punish those who don't conform to a narrow set of beliefs pushes people away from progressive causes and makes it harder to build a broad-based movement for social change.
It's like the old saying, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Mm,
Kovalik seems to be suggesting that the left's embrace of cancel culture is turning off people who might otherwise be sympathetic to progressive goals.
exactly. And I think he's concerned that this approach is going to backfire because it's going to make it harder to build the kind of coalitions that are necessary to achieve meaningful change.
He uses the example of Hillary Clinton and her infamous deplorables comment to illustrate this point, right?
Yes.
How does that fit into his argument?
Yeah, he argues that Clinton's dismissal of a large segment of the electorate as deplorables is a prime example of how the left's disdain for those who don't share their views can alienate potential allies and contribute to political defeat.
It's like writing off an entire group of people as inherently racist or sexist without acknowledging the complexity of their views or the economic anxieties that might be driving their political choices.
And I think that's what Kovalik is warning against. He's saying that we need to be more understanding, more empathetic, and more willing to engage with people who don't necessarily see the world the same way we do.
So instead of engaging in dialogue and persuasion, the left is resorting to shaming and exclusion, which ultimately undermines their own goals. It's a pretty damning critique.
It is, yeah. And he doesn't stop there. Kovalik goes on to argue that this woke mindset, with its focus on identity and purity, is also stifling debate and dissent within the left itself. He argues that the fear of being canceled is creating a climate of self-censorship, where people are afraid to express their honest opinions or to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy, even when they have legitimate concerns or alternative perspectives.
It's like everyone is walking on eggshells, constantly worried about saying the wrong thing and facing the wrath of the online mob. He gives the example of David Shore, the data analyst who got fired for simply tweeting a study about the effectiveness of peaceful protests. Why was this case so significant for Kovalik?
Well, for Kovalik, Shore's case exemplifies how even well-intentioned individuals can be targeted and punished for expressing views that, while supported by evidence, challenge a prevailing narrative within the left.
So instead of engaging in a discussion about the merits of the study, Shore was publicly shamed and ultimately lost his job.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty clear example of how cancel culture can stifle debate and punish those who dare to question the status quo, even within their own ideological camp.
It is, yeah, and it really highlights the dangers of this kind of, groupthink and the pressure to conform to a very narrow set of beliefs.
So Kovalik is painting a pretty bleak picture of the left's current trajectory. But he doesn't just offer criticism, he also provides an alternative path forward, right?
He does.
Okay, so to understand his solutions, we need to dig deeper into his critiques. And that leads us to another fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable topic that he tackles head-on, the phenomenon of white trash, and how it reveals a blind spot in the left's supposed tolerance and inclusivity.
Right. This is where things get really interesting.
So let's unpack this. What does Kovalik mean by white trash, and how does it fit into his larger critique of cancel culture?
Well, he's arguing that the casual use of the term white trash exposes a deep-seated prejudice against the white working class, a prejudice that's often overlooked or even excused in circles that claim to champion inclusivity and social justice.
Yeah.
And he connects this back to a larger issue, arguing that the liberal elite often looks down on the white working class, dismissing their concerns and failing to understand their struggles.
Mm-hmm.
He cites Thomas Frank's work, particularly his book Listen, Liberal, which highlights how the Democratic Party's abandonment of the white working class has driven them into the arms of the right.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. The left's disdain for the white working class fuels resentment, which then pushes these voters towards right-wing figures who, ironically, often exploit and betray them. Kovalik seems to be suggesting that the left is shooting itself in the foot by alienating a group that could be a natural ally in the fight for economic justice.
And I think that's a really important point, because if you're truly committed to fighting for social justice and economic equality, you need to build broad coalitions. You need to bring people together. And if you're alienating a large segment of the population that could be potential allies, then you're really undermining your own efforts.
And his critique doesn't stop at domestic issues. Kovalik takes this analysis a step further, arguing that this woke mindset and the tendency to cancel isn't just affecting our internal politics, but also influencing how we view and engage with the world, particularly when it comes to war and foreign policy.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't shy away from talking about the international implications of these ideas.
So how does cancel culture, as Kovalik defines it, play out in the realm of international relations?
Well, he argues that the obsession with identity politics has blinded many liberals to the war crimes and human rights abuses committed by figures they otherwise admire. He uses Barack Obama as a prime example.
Wait, Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the president who was often praised for his diplomacy and restraint?
Yeah.
Okay.
He doesn't shy away from criticizing Obama's record on drone strikes, the Libyan intervention, and his administration's mass deportation of undocumented immigrants. He argues that many liberals overlook these actions, often quite serious violations of international law and human rights, because they were so focused on Obama's identity as the first black president and his rhetoric of hope and change.
So it's like his identity shielded him from the kind of scrutiny and criticism that other leaders might have faced for similar actions?
Right.
Okay.
And he sees this as a dangerous precedent. He argues that this selective outrage, this willingness to overlook wrongdoing when it's committed by those we perceive as allies, is incredibly dangerous and allows for the perpetuation of violence and injustice on a global scale. You know, it's like we have these blind spots when it comes to people we admire or people we identify with.
So it's not just about holding individuals accountable. It's about recognizing the systemic nature of these issues and challenging the structures that enable these abuses, regardless of who's in power.
Exactly. And that's where I think his critique gets really interesting, because he's not just saying that, we need to be more consistent in our outrage. He's saying that we need to look deeper and challenge the underlying systems that produce these injustices.
Okay. So Kovalik provides numerous examples of how this dynamic plays out in specific conflicts. One particularly striking example is his analysis of the war in Afghanistan.
Right.
So the war in Afghanistan was incredibly complex and spanned decades. How does Kovalik connect this conflict to his critique of cancel culture and the woke mindset?
Well, he argues that many liberals were quick to support the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the subsequent military intervention, often framing it as a humanitarian mission to liberate Afghan women from Taliban oppression, which, was a dominant narrative in the media and political circles at the time.
Yeah, there was certainly a dominant narrative.
And he's not saying that, the Taliban was good for women, but he's saying that this narrative was often misleading and ignored the complex historical realities of Afghanistan. He points to the CIA's backing of the Mujahideen in the 1980s, which ultimately helped create the conditions for the Taliban's rise to power. He also criticizes the West's tendency to view Afghan women as passive victims in need of rescuing, ignoring their agency and their own efforts to fight for their rights.
It's a powerful critique of the often simplistic and paternalistic way the West views and intervenes in other cultures. Kovalik seems to be suggesting that this woke imperialism, while often well-intentioned, can be just as damaging as the more overt forms of imperialism that it claims to oppose.
Yeah, that's a really provocative argument, and I think it's one that's worth considering, because we often think of, imperialism as this kind of old school, colonial thing. But he's arguing that it can take on new forms, and that even these seemingly well-intentioned interventions can have unintended negative consequences.
So it's not just about our intentions, but about the actual impact of our actions.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Kovalik has critiqued the woke mindset, cancel culture, and their impact on everything from domestic politics to foreign policy. But he doesn't leave us in a state of despair. He also offers a way forward.
Right, he does.
Okay, so to understand his solutions, we need to dig a little bit deeper into his critiques. And that leads us to another pretty interesting concept he brings up, this idea of radical gratitude.
Yeah.
It might sound counterintuitive given his critique of the woke, but it's actually a central part of his vision for a more just and equitable world.
Right, it's kind of unexpected, isn't it?
Yeah.
Given everything else he's saying.
Yeah. So how does he define it, and how does it fit into his overall argument?
Well, he draws on the work of social critic Christopher Lasch, who argued that modern society suffers from a kind of radical ingratitude.
Okay.
A tendency to dismiss the achievements of previous generations and to view ourselves as uniquely enlightened and morally superior. And I think that's something we can all relate to in some way. We tend to look back on the past and see all the things that were wrong and all the mistakes that were made, and we forget to acknowledge the progress that has been made and the people who fought for that progress.
Yeah, it's like this historical amnesia,
Right.
like a failure to acknowledge the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before us and paved the way for the progress we enjoy today. I think we've all encountered this kind of thinking, this tendency to view the past as inherently backward and unenlightened.
And Kovalik argues that this radical ingratitude is not only disrespectful to those who came before us, but also prevents us from learning from the past and appreciating the complexities of history. He provides several examples of this in action, including the tendency to condemn historical figures for holding views that were common in their time, but are considered unacceptable today.
Right.
So it's like judging individuals from the past by the standards of the present without considering the historical context in which they lived.
Yeah. It's a form of presentism.
Yeah.
That can lead to a very distorted and incomplete understanding of history.
Exactly. And this radical ingratitude also extends to a dismissal of the intellectual and cultural achievements of previous generations. Kovalik points to the trend of banning classic books from schools and libraries because they contain language or themes that are considered offensive by contemporary standards.
Right. This ties back to his earlier discussion of Mark Twain.
Right.
And the controversy surrounding Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
A book that, despite its use of racially charged language, was actually a powerful critique of racism and slavery in its time.
Exactly. And Kovalik argues that while it's important to be sensitive to the concerns of students and readers censoring classic works of literature, ultimately deprives us of the opportunity to engage with complex ideas and grapple with the challenges of the past. It's like trying to erase history by pretending that certain books never existed, rather than using them as opportunities for discussion and critical reflection.
So it sounds like he's really advocating for a more nuanced approach, right?
It is, yeah.
Like acknowledging the complexities of history and not just, trying to whitewash it or erase it or, condemn it outright.
Right. And I think he's also making a point about the importance of context. When we're looking at historical figures or historical works, we need to consider the context in which they were created and the context in which they were received.
So we need to be careful not to impose our own present-day values and standards on the past. Okay, so Kovalik is advocating for a more nuanced and historically informed approach to social justice, one that recognizes the complexities of the past and the possibility of learning from its mistakes, both our own and those of our predecessors.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message because it's easy to get caught up in the outrage of the moment and to lose sight of the bigger picture.
Right.
But if we want to create lasting change, we need to be thoughtful and strategic, and we need to be willing to learn from the past, both the good and the bad.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And that leads to another crucial point that Kovalik makes throughout the book, the importance of action over rhetoric. He critiques the tendency, particularly among some progressives, to focus on virtue signaling and performative activism, often through social media, while neglecting the more difficult and unglamorous work of organizing, mobilizing, and building power.
So it's like prioritizing appearances over substance, talking a good game about social justice, but not actually doing the hard work required to bring about meaningful change. We've all seen examples of this, especially on social media, where it's easy to get caught up in the performance of activism rather than the substance.
Yeah, and I think he's making a really important distinction here between, talking about social justice and actually doing something to advance it.
So he's calling for a more action-oriented approach.
He is, yeah.
Like getting out there and doing the work.
Exactly. He argues that true social change requires more than just words and gestures. It requires concrete actions and a willingness to engage in the messy and often challenging work of building a more just and equitable world.
And I think that's a message that resonates with a lot of people who are feeling frustrated with the state of things.
Yeah.
They want to see real change. They want to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think Kovalik is providing a roadmap for how to do that. He's saying that we need to move beyond the keyboard activism and get involved in real-world struggles for justice.
So it's not just about awareness. It's about action.
Right. And I think he's also making a point about the importance of organizing. We can't achieve anything alone. We need to come together and build movements and work collectively to challenge the status quo.
And this brings us to Kovalik's ultimate message, which is a call for hope and optimism. He acknowledges the challenges we face, the injustices that persist, but he also sees reasons for hope. He argues that throughout history, social progress has always been driven by those who dared to challenge the status quo, to speak truth to power, and to work for a better world.
Right.
It's a reminder that change is possible even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We can draw inspiration from the countless individuals and movements throughout history who have fought for justice, often against incredible odds.
Right.
Their struggles remind us that we too can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message to end on, because it's easy to get discouraged when we see all the problems in the world. But if we lose hope, then we really have lost everything. So I think Kovalik is reminding us that we need to hold on to that hope, and we need to keep fighting for a better future, even when it feels like an uphill battle.
And that's a good place to end our discussion for today.
Yeah.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Kovalik's book goes into much greater depth on all of these issues.
And it's really a fascinating read. I encourage people to check it out if they want to learn more about this debate.
Absolutely. We'll pick up where we left off in part 2 of our deep dive into Cancel This Book.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So we were talking about this idea of radical gratitude.
Yeah, this idea that we need to be more appreciative of the progress that's been made and the people who fought for it.
Right. And not just dismiss the past as, inherently bad or wrong.
Because even though there were a lot of problems and injustices in the past, there were also people who were working to make things better.
Exactly. And I think Kovalik is arguing that we need to acknowledge that and learn from it. We can't just erase the past or pretend it didn't happen.
And he gives some pretty interesting examples of how this radical ingratitude plays out in our society.
Yeah, he talks about how we tend to judge historical figures by today's standards without considering the context of their time.
Which can lead to a pretty distorted view of history.
Yeah. Like you were saying earlier, it's presentism. We're imposing our own values and beliefs on people who lived in a very different time.
And he also talks about the trend of banning books from schools and libraries because they contain language or themes that are considered offensive by today's standards.
Right. And he uses Huckleberry Finn as an example.
Yeah.
A book that's often banned because of its use of racial slurs.
Even though it was actually a critique of racism.
Exactly. And I think Kovalik is arguing that by banning these books, we're not actually protecting anyone from harm. We're just depriving them of the opportunity to engage with difficult ideas and learn from the past.
So he's saying that we need to be more open to engaging with challenging material, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Yes. And I think he's also saying that we need to be more trusting of our students and readers.
Sure.
We need to give them the credit to be able to think critically and grapple with complex ideas.
Okay, so Kovalik is advocating for a more nuanced approach to history and literature. But he's not just talking about the past. He's also concerned about how this radical ingratitude is affecting our present and our future.
Right. He argues that this tendency to dismiss the past is also leading to a kind of complacency and a lack of urgency when it comes to addressing the problems of today.
It's like we're so focused on the progress that's been made that we forget that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Exactly. And I think he's arguing that we need to be more aware of the struggles that people are still facing and more committed to fighting for justice and equality.
So he's calling for a renewed sense of activism and a commitment to making the world a better place.
Exactly. And this is where his idea of radical gratitude comes back in. Because he argues that when we're grateful for the progress that's been made, it inspires us to continue that progress and to fight for a better future.
So it's not just about looking back, it's about looking forward.
Right. And I think that's a really powerful message.
Yeah, it's about taking inspiration from the past, but not being bound by it.
Exactly. And using that inspiration to create a better future.
So how does Kovalik propose that we do that?
Right.
Like, what are some of the concrete steps that we can take to move forward in a more constructive way?
Well, one of the things he emphasizes is the importance of dialogue and understanding. He argues that we need to be more willing to listen to each other even when we disagree. And to try to see things from other people's perspectives.
Yeah, that's easier said than done.
It is.
Especially in today's polarized climate.
Right. But I think it's essential if we want to make any progress. We can't just shout at each other and call each other names. We need to be willing to engage in respectful dialogue and try to find common ground.
And I think that ties into his critique of cancel culture. This idea that we need to be more tolerant of dissenting views and more forgiving of mistakes.
Absolutely. He argues that cancel culture is creating a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds and to engage in open debate.
Which ultimately stifles progress.
Exactly. And he also argues that it's often counterproductive because it tends to drive people further apart rather than bringing them together.
So instead of trying to silence people, we should be trying to understand them?
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with them?
Exactly. And I think that's a really challenging message, but it's an important one.
It is.
Because if we want to create a more just and equitable world, we need to be willing to work with people who are different from us and who have different views than us.
And that requires a lot of humility and empathy.
It does, yeah. And I think it also requires a willingness to be uncomfortable. We're not always going to agree with each other, and we're not always going to feel comfortable with each other's views, but we need to be willing to sit with that discomfort and to try to understand where the other person is coming from.
So it's about building bridges, not walls.
Exactly. And I think that's what Kovalik is ultimately calling for.
A more nuanced, more empathetic, and more constructive approach to social change.
Yes.
And I think that's a message that we can all get behind.
I hope so. So we were talking about building bridges and this idea that we need to be more willing to listen to each other even when we disagree.
Yeah, and try to find common ground.
Right. Because even if we have different perspectives on things, there's usually some area of overlap where we can find some agreement.
Exactly.
And I think that's where the real work of social change begins. Not in the shouting matches and the name calling, but in those quiet conversations where we're actually trying to understand each other.
So Kovalik is advocating for a more nuanced, more compassionate, and more constructive approach to dialogue and debate.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really lacking in our society today. We've become so polarized that we're not even willing to listen to each other anymore.
Right.
And I think that's really dangerous because when we stop listening to each other, we stop learning from each other.
It's like we're all trapped in our own echo chambers.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that Kovalik is trying to challenge in this book. He's saying that we need to break out of those echo chambers and start talking to each other again.
And it's not just about talking, it's about listening.
Right. It's about really trying to understand where the other person is coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
So it's about empathy.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's in short supply these days.
It is. And I think that's why this book is so important, because it's a call for a return to those values of dialogue, understanding, and empathy.
Yeah. And I think it's also a call for a more humble approach to social change. We need to recognize that we don't have all the answers and that we're all going to make mistakes along the way.
Right.
But if we're willing to learn from those mistakes and to keep striving for a better world, I think we can actually make a difference.
So it's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly.
And it's about hope.
It is, yeah. And I think that's the most important message of all. Even though Kovalik is very critical of cancel culture and the woke mindset, he's ultimately a hopeful person. He believes that we can create a better world if we're willing to work together.
And I think that's a message that we all need to hear right now.
I agree.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thanks for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Cancel This Book by Dan Kovalik. It's a challenging read, but it's also a very important one, and might just change the way you think about the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking exploration of ideas that matter. Until then, keep diving.